Welcome to the deep dive. We take source material, dig deep, and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you. Think of it as your shortcut to getting really well informed, maybe with a few surprising facts, and hopefully just enough humor to keep you listening. Today we're diving into the, well, incredibly rich and complex history of a nation right at the heart of Europe, the Czech Republic. From ancient legends all the way to modern democracy, I mean, this story is just full of twists, turns, and amazing resilience.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to help you understand the key milestones, those defining moments that shape the land and, its people. We're connecting the dots, basically, from prehistoric settlements right up to its place in the EU and NATO today. And we're drawing this directly from, well, a stack of historical accounts and academic work.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this. Get ready for a deep dive that should leave you with a real appreciation for this fascinating country. So our journey, it really begins way back in the mists of time. What do the sources actually tell us about the earliest people in the Czech lands?
Well, the evidence for settlement goes way, way back, prehistoric times. You probably had Celtic tribes first, and then later Germanic tribes. They were likely the earliest inhabitants we know of. But the real shift, the big change, happened around the 6th century AD. That's when Slavic tribes moved in and settled the area.
Right, the Slavs. And aren't there some, really vivid legends about their origins? I remember reading something about a Prince Crocus and his daughters.
Oh, absolutely. The legends are quite powerful. So the story goes that Prince Crocus founded the Czech state right there on the Vltava River, where Prague is today.
Right.
And his daughter, Lubuši, she supposedly prophesied that Prague would be built with great grass. Sounds a bit odd, maybe, but basically become famous. While her sister, Kazi, was known for her skill in medicine, these stories, they do more than just entertain. They really provide a kind of foundational narrative for that emerging Czech identity.
Interesting. So how did these early sort of scattered settlements start to coalesce into something that looked like a unified state?
That's the next big step. It raises that important question. How do you go from scattered tribes to, well, a state?
So what does this mean for, the birth of a distinct Czech identity? When does that start to solidify?
Well, this is where it starts getting really interesting. You move into the 9th century, and we see what the sources call the first crystalline forms of Czech nationhood.
Crystalline forms. What exactly are they getting at there? Like the first clear shapes of it?
Exactly. Yeah. Not just scattered people, but actual structures, shared culture starting to harden, you might say. And this happens with the rise of the Great Moravian Empire.
Ah, Great Moravia. So this is the first real state structure we see.
Yes, definitely. It's considered the first historic Slavic-based state in the region. It roughly covered today's Czech and Slovak republics, but also parts of Austria and Hungary. A big area. And under Prince Rastislav, they started fortifying, building things up, and they made a really crucial decision. They invited Byzantine envoys in 853.
Why Byzantine?
To introduce Christianity, but specifically in the Moravian language, using the Slavonic script. This was huge. It led to a flourishing of schooling, literature, art, all in their own language.
So not Latin like much of Western Europe, then?
Precisely. That choice set them on a slightly different cultural path early on.
But this Great Moravian Empire, powerful as it sounds, it didn't last forever, did it?
No, it didn't. After expanding under a later prince, Svatopluk, it came under attack from Hungarians and eventually dissolved. But Bohemia, the western part, it remained as a principality. And crucially, it kept that Christian liturgy in Slavonic. Then you have the Přemysl dynasty. They'd founded the early Czech state in the 10th century, and they gradually acquired Moravia too. The relationship between Bohemia and Moravia kept getting redefined until a ruler named Svetoslav decreed they'd always be inherited together. That really joined them. And what's fascinating here, something the sources point out, is how the Bohemian kingdom managed to stay intact. Unlike a lot of neighboring areas, these kralovadas, or royal lands.
Oh, right.
It wasn't just swallowed whole by bigger powers. It set a kind of unique path for itself.
Okay, so from these early foundations, you really see a distinct state starting to take shape and hold its own. Let's move forward then into the 14th century. We get to what's often called a golden age, particularly under Charles IV. What made his reign so important for the Czech lands?
Charles IV. Yeah, his reign, 1346 to 1378, was incredibly significant. He made Prague the actual seat of the Holy Roman Emperor.
Wow, okay.
Which, instantly elevated its status. It became the 4th largest city in Europe at the time. Huge. And he founded Charles University in 1348, the first university in Central Europe. This really fostered an environment where the Czech language and culture could could properly flourish. Prague got this reputation as a major cultural hub.
A real high point, then. But stability seems rare in this story. The early 15th century saw things change dramatically, didn't it? This immense energy turning into, as one source puts it, one of the medieval age's most cruel wars. The Hussite Wars. What happened?
Yeah, that golden age gave way to serious conflict. And this period, it really throws a spotlight on that connection between religious freedom and national identity. The conflict really kicked off around 1400. It was fueled by a couple of things. The growing popularity of the New Testament, which had been translated into Czech.
So people could read it themselves.
Exactly. And widespread complaints against the Catholic Church, which many saw as, well, sinful and corrupt. And into this steps Jan Hus. He gets excommunicated by the Pope, but becomes a leader of this reform movement.
And the response from the established powers was pretty harsh, I gather. The sources mention a White Crusade.
Extremely harsh. In 1421, a White Crusade was declared against the Czechs, basically. Catholic Europe trying to crush the Hussite movement by force. But despite this brutal crusade, the Hussites, they successfully defended themselves. Remarkably so. They even launched their own attacks, besieged towns, defeated papal forces repeatedly. It was a period of intense internal division too, mind you, but it absolutely solidified a unique Bohemian identity. You could argue the first truly Bohemian country, united by language and this specific faith, really formed around 1421 in the crucible of that war.
Incredible resilience there. But after the Hussite Wars, the Czech lands eventually ended up under the rule of another major power, the Habsburg monarchy. How did centuries under Habsburg rule affect Czech identity and culture? Especially think about that language suppression you mentioned earlier.
Right, the Habsburgs. This connects to the bigger picture, definitely. Their control really tightened after the Battle of White Mountain in 1620.
That followed the defenestration of Prague, right? Throwing officials out of a window.
That's the one, a dramatic trigger point. After winning that battle, the Habsburgs systematically clamped down. They repressed Protestantism, solidified their control. The sources talk about harsh and wide-ranging measures. They say the Habsburgs assiduously attempted to eradicate the Czech nation. Strong words.
Eradicate the nation. Wow.
Yeah, part of that was language. The Czech language was banned from government documents, from public life. For about 200 years, it basically became the language of the, quote, lower social strata. Pushed underground, really.
Yeah, that sounds devastating. How on earth did Czech identity survive something like that? 2 centuries is a long time.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? The sources talk about a period of long ethnocultural and political stagnation. But somehow, the spark remained. Then, in the mid-19th century, you start to see this general awakening of national pride. It's called the Czech National Revival.
Okay.
It involved scholars, writers, artists, but also ordinary people consciously trying to revive the language and culture. They founded the first theater in Prague, performing in Czech. Czech literature saw a modest revival. It was part of a wider Slavic Renaissance happening across Europe. What's fascinating is how, even after the language almost vanished from public view, that spirit of Czech nationalism just came roaring back. It really set the stage for everything that followed, for future self-determination.
So even suppression couldn't kill it. Moving into the 20th century, then, we have the catastrophe of World War I. How did that global conflict pave the way for something entirely new, the state of Czechoslovakia?
Well, the war fundamentally changed the map of Europe. For Czech leaders, it became crystal clear that if they didn't push for independence, continued German dominance within Austria-Hungary, or some successor state, was pretty much inevitable. So with the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsing, and crucially with the support of the Allies and President Wilson's 14 points championing self-determination.
Right, self-determination was key.
Exactly. Czechoslovakia was proclaimed on October 28, 1918, a brand new state born from the ashes of the old empire.
And the sources make a point of mentioning the Czechoslovak legions during the war. What role did they play?
The legions. They were really important both militarily and symbolically. These were Czech and Slovak soldiers, technically part of the Austro-Hungarian army, who either deserted or were captured, mainly on the Eastern Front, and then chose to fight for the Allies against Austria-Hungary and Germany, specifically for the cause of an independent Czechoslovakia. They formed units first in France in 1914, later in Russia, Italy, London, even America. They fought in significant battles like Zborov and Buzluk. Their existence and their fighting were crucial early steps in getting the Allies to recognize the Czechoslovak cause.
So they were like an army for a country that didn't exist yet.
Pretty much. But, while creating Czechoslovakia was this incredibly proud moment, the new state wasn't homogenous. It was multinational. You had Czechs, Slovaks, but also significant German and Hungarian minorities.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for challenges.
It definitely presented immediate challenges. The sources note that the German and Hungarian minorities were, quote, generally not willing to live with Czechs and Slovaks in one republic, though in the end they have little choice but to acquiesce.
So how did this new diverse nation function during that interwar period? What held it together?
Well, Czechoslovakia established itself as a parliamentary democracy, quite progressive for its time, with universal suffrage. It operated as a single governmental unit, but it was keenly aware of its precarious position. It relied heavily on alliances, particularly with France, and also cooperated closely with Yugoslavia and Romania in the Little Entente, mainly because everyone was worried about potential Hungarian ambitions to reclaim lost territory.
A functioning democracy, but in a tough neighborhood. That interwar stability, though, proved tragically short-lived. What happened when Nazi Germany rose to power?
Yeah, this leads into a truly dark chapter, the Munich Pact in 1938. It's infamous. Britain and France basically agreed to let Hitler carve off a large part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, without consulting the Czechs, hoping to appease him. Didn't work, of course.
A betrayal, essentially.
Absolutely. And it didn't stop there. By March 15th, 1939, Hitler's armies just marched into the rest of the Czech lands. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. It became a Nazi puppet regime called the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Czechs lost their civil rights. They were treated, as sources say, like slaves. Thousands were imprisoned or killed. Their culture was targeted for destruction, bookstores, library, theaters burned, a deliberate attempt at obliteration.
Just devastating. And then, after the horrors of Nazi occupation and World War II ended, the challenges didn't stop there for Czechoslovakia, did they? Liberation came, but
it came largely from the east, from the Soviet Red Army. And while that meant liberation from the Nazis, it soon ushered in a new form of domination. The sources call it a brief phase of false liberty.
False liberty.
Yeah, before Soviet influence really solidified. And this wasn't brief. It lasted for over 40 years. The Czech Communist Party, backed by Moscow, seized control, established an exclusionary stronghold on the political system, often using force and intimidation. They created what they called a People's Democratic Republic, which was in reality a communist dictatorship, part of the Soviet bloc.
A long period of hardship. But many people, especially internationally, remember the Prague Spring. What was that? A moment of hope.
It really was. The Prague Spring in 1968, led by Alexander Dubček, the party leader then, was this period of quite dramatic liberalization, relatively speaking. Dubček tried to implement reforms, things like easing censorship, allowing more open discussion, aiming for more economic autonomy from Moscow.
Yeah.
He talked about creating socialism with a human face. There was this incredible spirit of optimism and peacefulness, and it definitely caught the world's attention.
But Moscow wasn't pleased.
Not at all. They saw this departure from socialism, as they termed it, as a dangerous crisis, a threat to their control over the Eastern Bloc. So they initiated a secret operation codenamed Danube.
Danube.
Yeah. It culminated in August 1968 with a massive invasion by Warsaw Pact troops, Soviet, Polish, East German, Hungarian, Bulgarian, rolling into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. Dubček was arrested, the reforms reversed, and a period of harsh repression called normalization began.
So that hope was crushed by force. This long period of communist rule, though, finally did end in 1989. And it ended with a really unique event, the Velvet Revolution. What made that revolution so remarkable?
What's absolutely fascinating, it gives it the name Velvet, is how peaceful it was. The sources call it a sanguine tale of diplomacy and courtesy, which is just such a stark contrast to so many other revolutions, especially in Czech history itself, which often involved violence.
How did it unfold?
It started with student demonstrations on November 17th. These were met with police brutality, which actually galvanized wider public opposition. Things escalated very quickly. You had massive protests, hundreds of thousands of people, estimates range from 50,000 up to 300,000 gathering day after day in Wenceslas Square in Prague. The pressure just became overwhelming. Within weeks, the Communist Party leadership effectively acknowledged they couldn't govern anymore and resigned. Power transferred relatively smoothly to opposition groups led by figures like Václav Havel. It was stunningly fast and peaceful.
A bloodless transition, and this peaceful change then led, just a few years later, to another peaceful separation, the Velvet Divorce.
It's exactly. Following the revolution, there were discussions about the future structure of the state, the relationship between Czechs and Slovaks, and ultimately, the political leaders decided on separation. So, on January 1st, 1993, Czechoslovakia peacefully dissolved into two independent nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And the sources really emphasize how rare this was a peaceful split like this in recent world history. It was characterized by, quote, mutual understanding, tolerance, and nostalgia, even though Czechs and Slovaks had taken somewhat different historical paths over the centuries.
Yeah, that's quite something. I love that quote from the 8-year-old Czech citizen you mentioned in the outline.
Oh yeah, it perfectly captures the whirlwind of 20th century history for someone there.
Mm.
He said, look, I was born in Austro-Hungary, I grew up in Czechoslovakia, suffered from Germans, spent 50 years in a colony of Russia without ever leaving Prague. Now we're Czechs again like we've been for 1,000 years. It just encapsulates that feeling of finally reclaiming their distinct identity after so many upheavals.
Incredible perspective. So what did this new beginning, becoming the Czech Republic in 1993, mean in practical terms? How did the modern state establish itself?
Well, since '93, the Czech Republic has really established itself as a stable, functioning democracy with a liberal market economy. It moved quickly to integrate internationally, joined the UN almost immediately in 1993, then joined NATO in 1999, and later the European Union in 2004, really anchoring itself in Western structures. And economically, especially in that first decade, the growth was quite remarkable. The sources mention an impressive 7% increase per annum on average in GDP between 1992 and 2002. It became seen as a kind of benchmark among the post-communist transitional economies.
So a successful transition on many fronts. Looking back across all these centuries, all the changes, the conflicts, the transformations, how has Czech culture and that sense of identity managed to evolve and endure through it all?
That's a great question. Czech culture is often described using this idea of a lattice, like a framework woven together from its famous historical lands, Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. There are regional variations, but a shared core. And language, of course, is absolutely fundamental. We talked about the suppression under the Habsburgs, but despite that, the Czech language, which is a Western Slavic language related to Slovak, Polish, Sorbian, it saw these remarkable revivals driven by figures like Jiří Milančík in the 16th century, who reformed Czech spelling for printing, making books more accessible, and later the national revival figures in the 19th century. And what seems really striking, reading the sources, is how the vitality of Czech identity, its resilience, seems to come from what one source calls three interrelated components: cultural, historical, and political assertions against the non-Czech populations.
So defining themselves partly in relation to others.
In part, yes, but it's also described as an identity built strongly on things like, well, good manners, a deep respect for the land, strong folk customs, those legends we mentioned earlier, and just a profound shared history. It's apparently less about rigid traditionalism or nostalgia and more about this active, living connection to who they are.
And what about the arts? We touched on literature, but what else stands out?
Oh, art, and especially music, seem to be constant dominant characteristics. Music is described in one source as the most universal and pronounced manifestation of artistic feeling in the Czech lands, a place where, quote, invention easy and speech-free, a real sense of inherent musicality.
Like Dvořák and Smetana, of course.
Exactly. Those are the big international names. But it runs much deeper into folk traditions as well. And you can trace it back, that cultural flourishing under Charles IV. His encouragement of Czech poetry, Czech Bible translations that laid a foundation. It created this cultural reservoir that could be drawn upon, that continued to inspire revivals even after centuries of decline or suppression. It seems like creative expression often became this vital way of keeping the identity alive when political expression was impossible.
What an absolutely incredible journey through the history of the Czech Republic. Seriously, from those ancient legends right up to being a modern European democracy, it's just a story of profound resilience and this amazing cultural continuity.
It really is. It highlights so clearly how a nation's identity isn't just forged in the easy times, in peace and prosperity. Often it's shaped most powerfully, most deeply, through those moments of intense struggle, of suppression, and by that sheer determined will to reclaim its voice, its language, its sovereignty.
So as we wrap up, what really stands out to you from this deep dive? Is it maybe the stunning peacefulness of the Velvet Revolution after so much conflict?
That's definitely remarkable.
Or maybe the enduring power of the Czech language, surviving centuries when it was actively pushed down? Or just the sheer determination of the people to keep shaping their own destiny against the odds?
It could be any of those. Or perhaps it's simply understanding that, as the sources suggest, those old war scars, they might not ever completely disappear, but they can be transcended. They can be overcome by a spirit that looks forward, that keeps rebuilding and reinventing itself while still holding on to that essential core of identity. Something for all of us to think about, maybe.